Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
Locked and loaded, Donald Trump fired the first shots of his new era in Afghanistan rather than over the Korean Peninsula. But they haven't gone away, you know.
By the time he got to Phoenix for his next rabble-rousing, Donald Trump had Kim Jong-un firmly back in his sights. It could all end with a burger in a battle of the haircuts. Or we could all end up flame grilled.
Of course, Korea could be a cipher for China in all of this sabre-rattling by the US. At least that's my theory. But why deal with theory when we can hear the facts from an expert? Our first guest is eminent Professor Stephen Chan OBE of the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. Professor Stephen, thanks for joining us on the Sputnik. Is there any significance that the meeting in Camp David with his generals, about which he tweeted last weekend, seems to have been about Afghanistan rather than Korea? Or might they be going to fight on two fronts?
They're probably gearing up to at least be ready to fight on more than one front. But Donald Trump owed the world some kind of policy on Afghanistan. He also owed his military, who were waiting to see what they would be doing in that part of the world. So it was genuinely a meeting about Afghanistan, but I would be very surprised if other parts of the world, other theaters, weren't very, very deeply discussed.
Although, if you look back at his campaign pledges and his tweets, the last thing in the world you would have expected would have been Donald Trump to reinforce the failure of Afghanistan. Does he have any better ideas in relation to Korea? I have this vision of him like Dr. Strangelove astride a nuclear weapon with a cowboy hat on, shouting "Yee-hi" as he heads for Pyongyang. Might it come to that?
I think even his generals are very worried it might come to that, and they're trying very hard to act as a restraining force. You don't launch a military action unless you've got objectives that can be fulfilled, and wholesale destruction is not an objective that is very much recognized as desirable these days. But he really doesn't have a policy. He really doesn't have a strategy towards North Korea. It's very, very much bellicose rhetoric. And every single time he utters some of this very warlike talk, the North Koreans just call his bluff.
Yeah. But China has come up as well, and they made a clear stance. Has that kind of put Trump back in his place a bit,
And Russia also. They also warned Trump just in the last couple of days.
I think that world leaders, not just those world leaders, but many others have been warning Donald Trump not to take this beyond a certain very, very limited point. The entire Asia-Pacific community of nations, for instance, the last thing they want is a nuclear holocaust on their doorstep.
It's come to something that what is regarded as a primitive regime in Pyongyang seems to have outfoxed the might of the American diplomatic and propaganda machine. Would you say so?
They do games theory and they do negotiating strategy just like anyone else. And they've calculated they can call Donald Trump's bluff, because what are Trump's options? Either to continue sabre-rattling or actually to drop the bomb. And they know that he'd be very, very unlikely to drop the bomb given current world opinion. So they can push him and they can push him, and they're doing it very, very well. In the battle of the two sides, in fact, there's North Korea that's showing greater rationality of a bloody-minded nature right now.
Sanctions is what Russia warned about during the week, that don't put more and more sanctions onto North Korea because you're only going to push them into a corner where they'll really have little to lose.
Absolutely. Not only that, not only do you push the regime into a corner, those sanctions have a direct effect on the population of North Korea. And what that does is to make them more supportive of the regime. Yeah, so they become more patriotic as a result of that. So even if they don't have political desires for the regime to continue, just out of sheer patriotism, if it came to a firefight, they would stand with the current leadership.
Because many people watching this, probably against US hegemony, might find themselves over-sympathizing with North Korea. How do you characterize the regime in North Korea in terms of the political spectrum?
It's not just the West that finds North Korea enigmatic. And by enigmatic, I don't mean primitive. They're far more sophisticated in many ways than many people think. But even the Chinese and the Japanese find North Korea very difficult to deal with. This is historically the case, and certainly the case in modern times. The idea that they're a hermit kingdom, aloof and isolated by themselves, is a long-standing historical aspect of East Asian relationships. But underneath that very, very difficult, enigmatic surface, a very great deal of planning takes place. It's very bloody-minded. It's not exactly a user-friendly regime. The stories we get of great repression are largely true. But it is a regime which functions on a very strange kind of rationality, and it is rational, which has survived to this present day, which has a formidable military machine, and which has a government that is absolutely secure at this moment in time.
Is it left, though, or is it right? I mean, it waves a lot of red flags around, but this is a regime where the son followed his father and his son followed him, which even in the annals of communist nepotism has never been repeated before.
The Chinese leadership today would regard them as right-wing. Certainly, I think the Chinese would find them very antiquated in their thinking. The Chinese would like in North Korea a more progressive regime in terms of relationships with the outside world. They don't want to keep riding shotgun over North Korea forever. But at the same time, they're very, very loath to push beyond a certain point. There is still some kind of respect both for the integrity of North Korea as a sovereign state, and also above all, and I don't think the West really gets this, a very, very deep memory of the amount of blood that Chinese soldiers lost in the Korean War. When I go to China and I ask about Korea, the first response always is, but we can't forget our own people who died.
Is this something that, this hermit kingdom thing, does that apply to the mentality amongst the people, at least in the South? I mean, one regime after another has been more American than the Americans, but deep inside, are the people in the South the same as the people in the North?
I think that over the years there has been a separation between the two peoples, even though ethnically, of course, they come from exactly the same background. But I think it's probably not quite correct to say they're more American than the Americans. I think what they've tried to do is to become more Japanese than the Japanese. In other words, the Japanese who conquered them,
South Koreans.
Yes, in World War II, then set up an economic miracle, an industrial miracle. And what the South Koreans above all want, as a means of historical revenge, as it were, but peaceful revenge, is to be seen as even more successful economically and industrially than the Japanese. And that's a very clear distinction between South and North. Technological development in the North has been very, very slow by comparison.
It's, as I've heard you say before, it's based on a kind of mechanical process. Are they in the digital age now?
They've entered the digital age, but it's not widespread. And they've been experimenting with digital technologies by hacking into the receivers and servers of worldwide networks. They've learned how to do this very, very well. In terms of applying this wholesale to both their industrial development and particularly to their military development, they still haven't been able to do that successfully yet. So to that extent, the West doesn't really have much to worry about, because the grade of their efforts to acquire nuclear capacity, they may acquire a nuclear capacity of some sort, but their delivery systems, the reliability of their weaponry, all of that is going to be more than one generation old.
I've been there twice, and I found it, as a student of these things, interesting, but most peculiar. The guide I had, 24 hours almost a day, he was a good example of someone who was clearly very bright, but himself hermetically sealed. He knew nothing of the outside world and yet appeared on the face of it to know everything. And he genuinely believed, Kim Jong-il was the leader then, that Kim Jong-il was Superman, that he could look at a field of grain and tell the farmers how it might fructify more, that he could look at a piece of science or engineering or any other skill and lecture the people. He seemed really to believe that. Is this just a front, or are the people really in millions behind this Juche idea that the Koreans put forth?
The indoctrination schema are very, very strong and very long-lasting in North Korea. So I'm not surprised if people seem actually to believe this, whether or not underneath that there's a certain form of inscrutability, to use an old term, in which they're not quite as believing as they seem to. That's another question. But certainly people that I meet on the outside, North Korean ambassadors and North Korean diplomats, for instance, once you get down and dirty with them, meaning when you get drunk, they do seem to have a far greater amount of worldliness than meets the eye.
Oh. Well, that's interesting. As a non-drinker, I never get there, evidently. And the last Korean diplomat I met has done a runner and is now in Seoul or Tokyo or somewhere, spilling the beans on the North Korean regime. I entered the mausoleum, you might call it, kind of graceland of Kim Il-sung and now presumably his son Kim Jong-il. There was mass hysteria in the audience. They all burst into sobbing at exactly the same moment. So if it is just choreography, I mean, it's Busby Berkeley with rockets on.
Absolutely, but you've got to have a comparative dimension here. Very shortly after Chairman Mao died in China, for instance, the crowds outside lining up to go into his mausoleum were also genuinely mournful when people in the Soviet Union lined up to see the embalmed corpse of Stalin. There was genuine sorrow. Now, having said all of that, in certain Asian cultures, it is, as it were, a matter of good manners to be seen publicly to weep on an occasion which is meant to be a sad one. So what they might have been doing may have had nothing to do with hysteria and simply something to do with good manners. Someone in the crowd starts weeping. Well, you better start weeping too, otherwise you're going to be the impolite one in this gathering.
How extraordinary.
Amazing.
That's the real danger of North Korea, good manners. Professor, you're a genius. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
Barcelona, terror, where next? Stay tuned.
Welcome back to Sputnik. There should be no doubt that the world is at war. It's not a world war yet, but there is war throughout the world. Just last week, hundreds were mowed down by terrorists in Barcelona and Cambrils, in Finland, in Syria, Iraq, Nigeria. Trust me, I could go on.
Of course, the definition of terrorism is hard to agree. As the great intellectual Peter Ustinov put it, war is the terrorism of the rich and terrorism is the war of the poor.
But he said that a long time ago. Today's terrorism is a method, a means by which the innocent are made to pay the price for the guilty, a method of murder and mayhem which identifies the softest possible targets and murders them.
Russia also suffers terrorist attacks, mainly emanating from the same Al-Qaeda ISIS swamp which attacks people from Kuala Lumpur to Manchester with nobody left out in between.
Russia has actually defeated terrorism in the past, not something you could say for the Bush-Blair wars on terror. And a Kremlin advisor at the time they did is our next guest, Alexander Nekrassov, who joins us now. Thank you, Alexander, for coming back on the Sputnik. Let's start with Barcelona. This is a pretty perfect case study, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think it's the first time that we can peel the onion of the terrorist attack and see where it started, who is behind it, how it was prepared, and so on. Usually we get all the terrorists shot, killed, murdered, and we don't know anything. So this time round, we know that at a tiny, tiny town, Spanish town of Ripoll, which is only 11,000 people, it might be even called a village, there was this imam who was actually quite a colorful person with a colorful past. How he became an imam is difficult to understand, but he somehow managed to sort of slip, you know, through the net and use these human rights laws to remain in Spain. So this is the man who is the brain behind both of the attacks. And what is interesting is that it appears now that the Spanish police has found that he has a direct link to the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood. Now, that is where the whole story begins, sort of from the Syrian Middle Eastern angle. What is also has come out is that the mosque where he operated from was influenced by the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, I'd like to remind readers that the Russians, you mentioned that the Russian government managed to suppress terrorism. The Russian government banned the Muslim Brotherhood on its territory. It's considered a terrorist group. Now, it has been appealing to the Western countries to do the same, but it has not been done. And although there are calls, as I understand. Now, the linkage here is that the Muslim Brotherhood is financed by certain countries, including Qatar, at least they're accused of that, Kuwait, some others. And that is why one of the reasons why there is a conflict between Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and Qatar. Now, I must say that Russia today has been covering that conflict between the Arab nations, and somehow the Western media seems to be fallen silent about it completely, if you notice that.
Because they have friends on both sides, isn't it?
Yes, I know, but it is interesting because, you know, Russia did offer to help mediate, you know, this conflict, because really nobody wants this to get out of control. But strangely enough, the Western powers are saying, well, let's not, you know, let's not even talk about it. Let's just stop this. And turning to Saudi Arabia and Egypt and so on, they're saying, you know, lay off Qatar. You know, this is not a good idea because this is a principled conflict about, you know, supporting extremism, especially in Syria and now in Europe. And I think that's quite strange that we have a situation like that.
Well, strange indeed. As you know, I don't entirely share your view on this for a number of reasons. For me, Saudi Arabia and Qatar are exactly the same. Both are terrorist funders. Both are ideological fountainheads of this terror phenomenon. But I want to pick up something that you said, which was very profound, actually, when you talked about the colorful past of this imam outside Barcelona. I wrote recently that actually we're better looking not in the mosques, though we have to look there, but in the netherworld for the kind of people who will be up next to kill themselves and as many of us as they can take with them. Yet again, this imam even was a drug peddler, was in prison for importing massive amounts of hashish. The youth involved were only months before chasing girls, taking drugs, drinking alcohol, and time after time, from Nice to Berlin to Manchester to London Bridge and so on, these people who are committing these acts are not your regular prayer at the mosque, not Mr. Pious, but Mr. Strip Club owner in Molenbeek in Barcelona. I'm not making that up. The two guys in the Bataclan owned a strip bar in Brussels.
Well, it is amazing, and you're right, because what has come out from Ripoll is that these guys didn't really attend the mosque. They sort of came in once or twice, probably to meet the imam for something else. So the Muslims there are now quite upset about this, and they're saying, you know, they're not one of us. And this is one point. What I find amazing, and I think that, you know, people who are interested in the causes of terrorism and how it operates and how people are recruited, I advise them to read Fyodor Dostoevsky, The Devils, because The Devils is a novel about terrorism, but terrorism in Russia. But the interesting thing is that Dostoevsky describes what sort of people go into terrorism and how they operate. And for example, he was the first, great writer to say that they operate in cells that don't know each other. So one of the people in the book who is in charge of this terrorist organization, he tells one of the characters, oh, they don't know each other. I know, but they don't know each other. So even if one cell is smashed, the others don't know who the others are. And I think Dostoevsky, he put his hand on it, that these people who are terrorists, he says, are not really about any religion. These people are mostly criminals about power and money. Or they are criminals because they are, petty criminals. Just like these guys, into drugs, into this, into that. And I think this is the important message that governments fail to deliver. We have to distinguish religion and terrorism. And this is not working because basically the opinion in the West, oh, Muslims, terrorism. This has to
It's a mistake, yeah.
This has to be divided.
This is the first time, though, that, I'm well aware of cell structure, both in terrorism and even in revolutionary politics, revolutionary struggle. If you're a revolutionary, a cell is a good idea. But this is the biggest cell I ever heard of. There's, I don't know how many dead, how many in prison. It's a pretty big cell in a very small town. It amazes me the Austin Powers caliber of those who are fighting the terrorism. How is it not possible to notice a growing bond between a group of the best part of 20 people, all of fighting age, before they explode?
Well, first of all, I think that in this town, I think there was only one policeman or something, as far as I know. And I think that the reason...
On a bicycle, probably.
I think the reason why they chose this town is because exactly for that purpose, who would think that it's there? They would look at big cities, they would look at metropolises where there's a possibility, they're sort of thinking about, big mosques and so on and so on. But you said that you did not agree with me. Now, I think that this strategy was not devised by Imam, but this Imam. This comes from the Muslim Brotherhood, the people who are, understand how it's done. And they are quite strong in Syria, by the way. They are the ones who are waging the war. And I have just read yesterday that the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria is side by side with Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So, yeah, they're cooperating. So you see, this is a very powerful entity now. And it's not a coincidence that the Russians immediately pointed out the Muslim Brotherhood because they saw the danger in Russia for them. And that is why, and they do talk to the Western governments and tell them about this problem. Now, I think this has something to do with strategy developed by somebody else. This guy, Imam, this Imam, he doesn't look like, a strategist.
So you don't think it's a copycat? You think it's properly, organized?
I think it was very carefully planned by somebody else, because George pointed out quite correctly, he did it with drugs, he spent time in prison.
Years, yeah.
He doesn't look like a man who thinks, in a way that is strategic. So somebody else somewhere was giving him instructions, and somebody else somewhere chose this small, I don't know, village, town, how you call it, Ripple. And that's why I think, the reason why I started peeling the onion of this terrorist attack, I think this is a situation which exists somewhere else as well.
Sure.
That is why now they will have to look for these tiny, tiny small towns and search there, because suddenly they're confronted with a very different problem, something that is completely, they're unaccustomed to it.
Yeah, but
Send for the Russians. That's what I say. It's the only way we're going to get out of this. Let's put a Russian in charge. Put you in charge. Alexander Nekrassov, thanks for joining us on
Thank you.
SPUTNIK. And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
So you recently tweeted a doomed president, a doomed war, and a doomed empire. To which Simon replied, the doomed are those troops sent to the pointless war. And for what end, apart from greasing the arms industry pockets? And Adam Smith said, well, he surely hasn't learned from history. that Afghanistan is an unwinnable war?
Well, Afghanistan is an unwinnable war, and Korea is even more unwinnable.
I would think
because
so.
at least the Afghans are fighting in their sandals with primitive rifles, some of which they stole from the Russians as long ago as the 1980s. The Koreans, on the other hand, have millions of people under arms, bristling with nationalist feeling. Any attack by Trump on Korea will see a complete conflagration in the region.
Exactly. And that's all the tweets we've got time for today.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
But you can stay in touch with us on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today, or Twitter and Instagram, RT_Sputnik. Goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvelous.